What's up, Covalence friends and coders? So, today I made two decisions. One was to record a video about a topic that I worked with a student of ours earlier this week. And that topic was, what exactly is .env doing and how is it doing it? And the answer really wasn't that complicated. And we decided to even make our own little opinionated .env that does stuff we want it to do. So we had a little more granular control. The second decision I made was to, well, inadvertently wear a sweatshirt that is the same color of my green screen, which is why you're going to see me as a disembodied head floating in VS Code. So, for this project, just did an npm init. We're not going to need a whole lot of files or a whole lot of setup. I'm just going to have an index.js and a .env file. And for the .env file itself, you can have it be spaghetti.txt. It frankly doesn't matter. If we want, we can make our function a little more configurable to accept alternate paths, but what I will be starting with, at least, is assuming a .env file at the root of your project, which is also the default behavior of the real .env node module. So I'm just going to keep that standardized. So I'm going to stick a couple values in here. One of the things we also worked with is I decided to do some data validation. Key no value. So I'm going to throw in a bunch of extra white space. I'm going to throw in some keys without values, some values with no keys, some straight up garbage data. And we'll get this accommodated for. Oh, and if you don't know the Hunter 2 reference, well, that goes back to the good old days of IRC, Internet Relay Chat, and if you don't know what that is, it was kind of like the precursor to a lot of more modern chat like AIM, and if you don't know what AIM is, it was AOL Instant Messenger, and if you don't know what AOL was, it was when we got internet in CD format in cereal boxes. So I may have just dated myself a little bit with those terms, but if you're not familiar with that, go look it up. Bash.org is going to be hours of just wasted time reading a bunch of text logs from chat rooms way back in the early 2000s. Anyway, we've got our index.js, and the .env library, I'm pretty sure, handles everything completely synchronously. In fact, I'm like 95% certain. But, you know, we're going to make it asynchronous just because I like dealing with async stuff whenever possible. So we're going to make it a little more opinionated and do that. And that's the nice part about doing this is you get to effectively have the same functionality as another library. It's not a lot of code and you get a lot more control. So, you know, why not? So I'm going to import the fs promises library. I don't think path has that yet. Does not. But I mean, path is going to be just like concatenating strings. It doesn't really have to be async. So on that note, like I said, by default, I'm going to assume that we've got an env file at the root of our directory. And that's actually how .env does handle it. You can supply your own path variable, and if you don't, in the absence of that, it's going to assume this exact same thing. So this is going to stay pretty standardized. We're going to resolve this, you know, full path join together, this full directory with that .env file. We are going to be using this asynchronously, so I'm going to make an async function here. And I'm going to call this config, just keeping it in line with what .env does, you know, may as well. So, yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. Going to set up our try catch here. And in the event of an error, because, you know, we're using FS, trying to read and write to files could be error prone if the file moves or is deleted or you just screwed up with the path name. You know, that could cause some issues. So We'll go ahead and do our error handling first. And so I'm going to log out, Andrew broke this, and you are free to do the very same thing in your applications as well. Please, I encourage you, play the blame game with me, and just let me know if you've ever done that in one of your applications. I would love to see some random code in the wild saying Andrew broke this. And we're also going to shut down this application. You know, if an error happens, I mean, that's going to get thrown here. There's not going to be any other code that really needs to run. And think about it this way too. If you're trying to run an application and you can't for some reason read your environment variables that are absolutely critical for, you know, establishing your database connection, creating your authentication, you know, security credentials, whatever, that's pretty critical. Like, so with this, I'm going to shut down the process. I'm going to crash the application in the event that this is broken. So here I'm going to take our env and, you know, looking at the structure of it, how we're going to read this file. It's not a specific structure. It's not JSON data or anything. It is just a plain text file effectively. So we can almost think of this as just a really long string. I mean, that actually is what this whole file is. It's a string with a new line character, string, new line character, new line, string, new line, new line, new line, blah, 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 blah. So this is just one large string. But the cool thing is we can actually use that new line character in the string.split operation, which that's going to take your string, remove that item that you're splitting upon, and return everything around it. And so if I use the split operator on new lines, I'm just going to get every line as a separate string in an array. So this variable I will call lines, and I will say await fs.read file env path, and I'm not providing any encoding, so it's going to return everything as a buffer, just that raw data. So I can just say toString as is, get our goal ASCII characters and lines here. This is actually going to be the single like string, so I might split that up into two separate variables, like mega string. We'll call it that. I like that name. And lines will be mega string broken up. That's where we'll actually do the split. So we'll say split on the new line character. So if you want to see what that looks like, let's go console log lines. Oh, I never invoke config, so of course that never runs. Classic Andrew folly. Console.log Andrew forgot to do this. So this is lines. It kind of looks like our file, except it's now an array of strings. But we can see that there is a lot of garbage in here already. And, you know, like I said earlier, or I may have said this earlier, you really probably wouldn't be deliberately putting in garbage data in your env, but, you know, we may as well do some validation just to ensure that we have only good stuff taken care of. So this is bad junk. A lot of this is bad junk, but we can figure out what's good and what isn't a little more in-depth later. So we'll have a couple steps. First is I need to get rid of just these empty strings. And thankfully that's really easy to do with filter. So array.filter, what we're going to run on this, it will return a new array, and it returns a new array with items based upon where every sub-item gets a truthy condition. So if we're thinking about just evaluating a string here, if I were to say like if encapsulating the string, what would that, result in? Well, that would be truthy. This string has actual content. It's going to be implicitly truthy. Same thing here, same thing there, there. Empty strings are going to implicitly be falsy. So we can basically just filter over our array of lines and take every line and return where a line implicitly evaluates as true. So what that looks like is something like this. We'll take every line, and this is effectively saying return where every line does not equal an empty string. But this is a filter I do a lot to remove falsy values from arrays. So if we also have like null or zero or false, just kind of scattered around everywhere in here, this is a great little thing. I use that a lot in like code golf, x return x, something like that. And that is a really, really easy way. But here, actually I'll go ahead and explicitly spell it out. So just by doing this, takes that giant garbage dump from before and actually kind of consolidates it pretty nicely. So we need to do another couple things. So we have our true words here, but not all of them are key value pairs, only the first two. So how can we evaluate for that? Well, one thing we could do is we can map over these, and for every line we have, return the line split here on an equal sign. And so theoretically what we should end up is an array of one string, the key, and of a second string, the value. And this would end up with this as a string, and then the second item, well, with dot split, what's to the right of this? An empty string. So we're going to have, some empty strings coming back into play for these two. This is going to be just an array entirely of empty strings. This will be itself, that'll be itself. So let's kind of look at the structure of that. And I'm going to call that variable pairs. So we're going to map over lines again, and for every line, we're going to return the line split on the equal sign. So we'll have some definite outliers, and we can actually kind of filter through that pretty easily because we should be expecting a very specific format. The array length should be a quick indicator. So if the array length is 2, that's legitimate, that's legitimate, that's not, but that would kick out this, kick out that, kick out that. So we'd be able to kind of cut our items in half, and then from there we could do an additional filter for every individual item to remove falsy stuff. So this would be an array length of 1, and that would be 1. Or we could kind of do the opposite order, to where I do that filter first. If I take every line that we split, every array here, and do that filter first, that remains 2, the above remains 2, that becomes 1, that becomes 1, this becomes an empty array. That stays 1, that stays 1. And after that, we can do a filter on all of the pairs. So we'll kind of do 2 filters here. We've got to do a lot of cleanup, because this is really garbage data that I've put into play here. Like I said, I'm not actually sure if .env does something like this or not, but it's going to be something that we do, because might as well. We've got our own opinionated code, so why not? So we will filter on every split line and return, basically the same thing. I'm just going to do x return x here. It's basically saying, this filter is running on every individual line. So it says x. Is x truthy here? We're returning that. Is x truthy here? It's not. We're not returning that. So just that little change, that filter x return x, or I guess we could replace that with string. Just from doing that gets us something dramatically different, very much cleaned up. So pairs is this array, and now we can filter over pairs and say, hey, return only where the array length is 2. Because if the array length is 2, that means we have pretty safely validated that we have the good, best data possible. And that's going to eliminate that, and that. So I could chain on filter here at the end of this line, or I could just make another variable for readability's sake. So let's do that. And we're going to return where every pair.length is explicitly equal to 2. There might be some edge cases that I'm not validating for, but this should be pretty solid for getting garbage data out the way. So now, from that, we have our key value pairs. The only problem is I'm using the term key value pairs, and this really quite isn't that. These are just arrays. They're basically tuples. Arrays with the key as the first argument, pair value as the second argument. So I need to get that into an object, which is not too terrible. In fact, say const r values is equal to an empty object. We'll start with this empty object. And then I need to loop over valid pairs. And then basically just say index position 0 is our key, index position 1 is our pair. So for each pair we have, we have pair at index position 0 as our key, pair at index position 1 as our value. I could do something like this. Our values at pair at index position 0 is equal to pair at index position 1. I really do not like this because readability of this sucks. I hate that. So what we could do instead is, if this is a predefined order, it's always going to be, key, comma, value. We can just do array destructuring on our pair argument here. So if pair is the array, we can just array destructure the index position 0 item as key and the index position 1 item as val. So we can replace that with our values at key is equal to val. Or let me replace that with value. That reads out so much more nicely. So we have our values now populated with everything in our key value pairs. So if I log out our values, it should basically be this, but in object format. And indeed it is. So how can we do what .env does, which is securely get this into our process.env? What even is process.env? It's your environment variable. It's accessible to the node process. And we can take our own variables and put them in there. So how can we do that? It's one of those things where you're like, oh god, that seems like a nightmare programmatically, but it's very easy. So a method we oftentimes use for copying an object.assign, we can actually use to, well, as the name suggests, assign a value. So a lot of times you'll see object.assign used to copy something. So if I wanted to copy our values, I would say object.assign. The target is this new empty anonymous object that we just put here. And the values we want to copy are our values. And so object.assign will give this empty anonymous object the properties of our values, and it's also going to return that too. So copy is going to be a copy of our values. So this is how you will see it very, very frequently, but it's not what we want to do per se. Instead, target. What exactly does that mean? It means where are these values getting copied to? And in our use case, it's actually just going to be process.env. We are going to copy our values to process.env. And so before that, let me console log out process.env. This is going to be just like my system-wide environment variables. We'll see kind of the tail end of it, just because I have a short console log here. And I'm running this before we actually copy our values into it, so we can just see the last few. So it's just got some VS Code stuff, my home directory, my node options. But once I actually let this update process.env, once I log it out again, we're going to see our variables there. So we have these values injected into memory, accessible by my process. So now you can set up your config as you typically would do. So let's look at kind of taking that into account. I'm actually going to, let's see. Let me make a file called config.js. And I'm going to rename my index to notenv. Haha, how clever, right? Boo. I sincerely hope somebody actually did boo from the comfort of their computer chair for that horrible, horrible pun. Let me export this config function. Or actually, let me make it the default export, because I want to keep this as close to .env as I can within reason. So exports is equal to an object with config inside of it. There we go. So in here, I would say const notenv is equal to require notenv. Oh. Well, I am running, hold on. I am running v18.6, so I actually can use top level await. I think. We'll find out. So with me making everything asynchronous, I do have to await notenv.config. Let's see if that actually works. So yeah, instead of .env, it's not env, and we made it a little more opinionated by making it asynchronous. So that now we'll have injected values into process.env, and now I can take them and const secrets equal password. Password is going to be process.env.secret_password, I believe. Secrets.youtube process.env.yt, I think, channel. I don't remember if that was the variable name or not. Yes, it was. Cool. So here's all of our source code. I would, git init this, create a git ignore my env just to make sure I wouldn't commit this. But here, everything else is my source code. Here's our .env, our little loader, and here's my config file, where I can access secrets.whatever in my code, and this is my source code. Can that, tell anybody what those values are? No. Is everything nicely and securely hidden? Yes. Yes, it is. If I were to make an index file again, so let me export secrets out. In my index, import config from, or whoops, const config equals require config. Very inventive variable naming conventions, I know. Then I'll just do console.log, YouTube channel is config.secrets.youtube. And then here I'll say best password in the world. Is config.secrets.password. Which, I'm saying hunter2, but you guys can't hear it. It's just going to sound like a bleep. And when you see it on screen, it should just be a bunch of asterisks. So you won't be able to see go hunter2 yourselves, Let's go ahead and run this code. I'm going to import everything, and then we'll do these console logs for my index. So just trying to make this feel like as application-like as possible by, having this .notenv module that we import into our config, and then we, create our config objects that we export out, and then we import our config objects wherever we need to use them. So, oh, what did I break? Oh, yeah. So that's what I get for making everything asynchronous. I could just not. And that does follow the behavior of .env itself. There we go. Oh, and let's see. So I'm still using the async style without the callback structure. Come on, Andrew. This is why I need TypeScript. I should have done this with TypeScript instead. Prosectish. Come on. Alright, fourth time's the charm, am I right? And there we go. I'm still logging out process.env in our config. Or in there. Alright, fifth time's the charm, just the strings that we need. So we are able to take the data from within this file, and using our config file, we can invoke the notenv config function, which goes ahead and injects everything. Then here we create our config object, reading out of memory the values we want to pull down. So this is what's part of our source code. It's what gets committed. Let's see. Echo.env to .getignore. I'm going to create a getignore file and then run git init, so that way that env gets ignored. Alright, but yeah, that's not env for you. So just kind of making it a little more opinionated. If we wanted to, what we could do is create like an optional object here full of arguments, and I'm not exactly sure what else the regular .env module needs as optional arguments, one of which of course is the path variable. So if somebody wants to provide one, we could utilize that, or we could just give our own one as, heck, let's do that. Oh, crap. what should I name this module instead? Node path. Didn't quite catch that. There we go. So we'll allow people to either invoke this without that object, and if they don't send it, then we will default to one with node path. Or actually, no, because it's going to expect an empty object as the argument otherwise. And I don't know, I kind of hate the structure of that. Let me do a default argument of an empty object. Yeah. So let's do that. So if you provide an argument, an options object, it's going to have a path variable in it, but if you don't, we are going to give a default value of an object with a path property whose value is that. Okay, that's a little more like it. That's pretty spanking close to what .env does. And now if you wanted to, let me rename this file to .wow. So now whenever I call config, I can give it an object with a different path object. So and I need to call this node path. So no, because I'm not using it as a variable, I'm just using it an object key, so I could just keep that path, I guess, but require path. Alright, so I could leave it as is. It's going to look for a .env file, which I don't have, so it's going to cause an error. Error no entry. It's going to crash the app as it should. Or, if I don't do that, we can create our own path here. So .wow. So if I don't have a .env file, I can specify where exactly it is, or if I do have one but it's not at the root of my directory, we're going to be able to create our own path. So this is what the env module does, and it does handle everything synchronously. So I think we got this pretty close to how its actual behaviors are. It might take some more config stuff behind the scenes, but I think we are pretty close to doing whatever it needs to do. Now if I rename this back to .env, if I get rid of that options object altogether, it's going to say, hey, that object that you were supposed to send is undefined, so we're going to give a default value of an object with a path property of the .env at the root of the repo. So we're still going to be able to read everything out. Okay, I'm kind of happy with this. We'll go with that. So here is our relatively faithfully replicated version of .env. I hope you guys liked this. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. If there's something else you'd like to see us, take a crack at replacing, I think that would be great. It was really fun doing this earlier this week with a student, and it was really fun doing it for you guys today in kind of a different way than what I did earlier this week. So if you would like to see more videos like this, go ahead, like and subscribe. Otherwise, we'll see you later.